Dr. Maggie Little is Senior Research Scholar. Is that still accurate?
Yes.
Senior Research Scholar. I want to make sure I have, sometimes there's old ones up on the web. Senior Research Scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics and Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown. Her research interests include issues in reproduction, clinical research ethics, data ethics, and the structure of moral theory. That's as much as we'll go on that. She's a Rhodes Scholar, a fellow of the Hastings Center, and she has twice served as visiting scholar in residence at the National Institutes of Health Department of Bioethics, and was appointed to the Ethics Committee of the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. She's co-founder of the Second Wave Initiative, which works to promote responsible research into health needs of pregnant women. And you are also run the ethics lab at Georgetown. So thank you so much. There are always sort of tricky questions in pregnancy and research. And, our patients have those questions, and we're just excited to hear from you about how you operate in this, vulnerable population, and what kind of research we can do and what you think is the right thing to do. So I'm gonna give you a code. Do you have slides, or are you just talking?
I do have slides
Okay.
and I can share screen. So
yeah,
let me sort of set the context, and then I'll move over to slides. So as Kara said, for quite a while, I've worked on issues and been passionate around issues about how we can include the needs of pregnant women into research in the safety and effectiveness of drugs that can help treat conditions of pregnancy for the benefit of the woman and the baby. So for a long time it's called clinical research, so the development of new drugs, pharmaceutical companies and the folks that also oversee proposals for research in patients, where it's highly regulated, which is a great thing. But both the developers in drugs and the regulators of drugs didn't want to touch diseases of pregnancy. Now, some of that was for understandable worries about legal liability, but they were sort of overblown. But a lot of the reasons were a sort of cultural reason that touching pregnant women is too scary. And in particular, after the thalidomide disaster, where a drug that looked like it could help pregnant women experiencing severe nausea, some of you have been through that, and it's, for some people, the equivalent basically of chemotherapy in terms of nausea. My sister suffered and had to go to the hospital. But at any rate, it was a drug, this is the 50s, Kara? The 50s, so 75 years ago, where it looked like it was going to be very helpful for that. And so Britain said, but not in pregnant women, we don't have enough evidence. The United States said, let's go for it because the patients need it, but didn't do enough safety studies. And that turned out to yield children with severe birth defects. Well, that was a mistake the US did. They allowed a drug onto the market without enough safety testing. Okay, now the lesson of that should have been really increase your safety testing in ways at early stages, like with animal studies, which we'll talk about in a minute. But instead, it sort of froze and shut down research on anything to do with pregnant women. And that's bad for the health of pregnant women and babies. So their very desire to reduce risk to pregnant women and their babies actually ended up increasing risk for pregnant women and their babies, and putting pregnant women and their families in a horrible situation when they had illness during pregnancy or became pregnant while they had an illness, right? A terrible situation of being offered either no intervention or a drug that they probably needed deeply for their health and the health of the baby. But when they said, is this safe, doctor? The doctor could only say, we don't know. Okay, untenable. So the good news is that there's been a real alliance of patients and caring physicians and people in the clinical research community who really develop frameworks for safe research, to come together and to change that that culture, and to move from a sort of culture of it's wrong to do research in pregnant women to it's a moral imperative to do responsible research with pregnant women, or else we leave them and their babies as what are called research orphans, that their diseases don't get the investment of research to help them, as opposed to being left on the sides. So my own involvement, Kara mentioned some things. So I have been involved in advocating for not just women's reproductive life, but for pregnant women's health and that of their babies. I mean, you can see my gray hair. I feel like it's been 25 years now. And as part of that, being part of and developing an alliance on the need to do responsible research with pregnant women, lots of conferences and publications and the like. Then I was very lucky, as Kara mentioned, I was twice a visiting scholar at the National Institutes of Health, which is the big federally funded public interest, right, group that does research with populations that often nobody else wants to touch, but they also develop the ethical frameworks for doing best practices that protect patients. So when I was there, my remit was to come and do deal with ethical frameworks for research with pregnant women. So I've been at it a long time, and it's still a passion area of mine. With that having been said, I want to share just a few slides and have a discussion with all of you about, in some sense, demystifying what the research process looks like in general, and then how it applies to pregnant women, so that people do get a sense as drug companies, and there's some pharmaceutical companies that we might have concerns with on what their motivations are and what their priorities are. I actually think different divisions and different companies differ, and some of them are great. But there are also some smaller companies founded to help advance pregnant women's health, including preeclampsia. Kara and I are both on an advisory board to one, and they were founded to deal with this disease, right? Not to make lots of money. At any rate, to demystify a bit, what is the process they follow to bring a drug to market? And what does it look like when they're doing that in a very complex population of pregnant women whose health and that of their babies are at issue? Okay, so share screen. Okay. Can you all see now and move to slideshow? Yeah, you can see my.
Yes, you're
Great.
good.
I didn't cue it up at the start. There, that's me. Okay, demystifying clinical research with pregnant women. Okay, so I want to do three things, and again, it's just a few slides. The clinical research process for new drugs, because that can just feel like a black box. Second, the regulatory protections for the participants that enroll in these research projects. It's a matter of enormous structural oversight, as well it should be. And then third, the special principles when we do that sort of research with pregnant women in order to get them the drugs they need. Okay, let's start with new drug development. Okay, the idea of a new drug starts with lots and lots of what are called bench science discovery. And this means scientists who are learning a lot about how the body works, how biological processes work, how the molecules in the body work, and what kind of drugs or that exist and could be reapplied here, or that are can be new formulations that they realize might, and the emphasis is on might, help treat a disease or prevent an infectious disease. You guys can start thinking of the vaccine development, right, with COVID. And they're just developing hypotheses and conjectures. There's reason to believe, like scientific reason to think this actually might help, but we don't know. Okay. So then sometimes those discoveries suggest an idea for a new drug to prevent or treat an illness. Okay, so now this group has an idea and some evidence. Here's why I think it really might work. They have to go secure money. The research can take hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, and there are a lot of ideas that aren't worth really investing in that. But if they do get those dollars, and often from non-for-profit places, then the research to see if this drug will really work and be safe can begin. Okay, so now we get into what I think of, but I can nerd out on this, is a really fascinating, what does it look like to do the research? Well, it takes years for one thing. Let's look. Here are the questions that they have to answer. Does the drug really work? We hope it does. We think it might, but does it? Is it really safe? Might it have harmful side effects that outweigh its benefits? We need to know that. If it does look like it might work and be safe, what dose should be used? And that turns out to be actually be a very complicated scientific question. They have to try a lot, but do it safely. And then fourth, they need to learn about what special conditions might make it inadvisable to take the drug. So even if it's generally very effective, very safe, we know the dose, they might find what they call contraindications. For instance, let's say you had kidney disease and the drug actually is hard on the kidneys. If that's problematic enough, they might say, we don't advise using it for people in your condition. We'll try something different. So those are the key questions that research has to answer. Okay, so here's the research roadmap. This is the part that I mean, gets very, very fun details, but I made a cute picture. Okay, so you start with, you've already done the bench science, you've got a conjecture. Okay, now, first we try the drug in animals, a chosen type of animal that we think has similar biology with respect to the disease we're trying to look at. Okay, so with pregnant women, it turns out we want animal models that have the same layers of cells in the placenta. That's why it gets exciting. Okay, after you do the animal studies, the research stops. The data that's been gathered goes to the Federal Drug Administration, goes to the FDA, which is thousands of people who are complete experts in, the nerding out stuff. Okay, and they scrub it for months to see if it looks like there are any safety signals. Okay, if they say it looks a little too dicey, the trial ends. It was a conjecture, but we can't proceed. If it says, wow, it really does look like this is safe, and it looks like it helps, then we move to a second stage that's called healthy volunteers. And healthy volunteers, this is the standard at least. We don't yet want to do the research with the patients suffering from the disease because they're already under medical burden. Okay, so we start with healthy volunteers that really do volunteer to do this. And again, there are lots of regulations and they're told this is an early stage, right? And it's just a small group. And often, sometimes they might be people like who know somebody who has the disease and want to help, right? And so these are people for whom we're checking how does the drug work in the human body in general. Right? Does it raise blood pressure problematically? Does it not? Okay. Then again, we pause. Tons of data has been generated. We send it all to the FDA. I'm talking, I mean, if you printed it out, but you get the idea. Things that are this big. The FDA checks it, it might stop. If they say this looks really encouraging for safety and efficacy, then we start with a small group of patients with that disease, right? And they again are told, and this is the stage it's at, we don't know whether it works, but we have encouraging results. People volunteer. They could also say no, thank you. But volunteering, it's a small group with, again, lots and lots of oversight for data, even as it comes in, right? So that we know if there's something worrisome, we would pause. Check the data. This one's, of course, really important. We have more information. If the FDA says, I think this really looks great, Then we have to do a trial with a big group of patients with the disease, because you need a lot of a big number to check for, to get better statistical validity, it's called. So imagine that there's small probability problems. You wouldn't find it in the small group necessarily, but you have to check for what happens at big numbers. FDA checks it again. If they think if it's safe and effective, they license it to be available to patients. Okay. Now let's move to demystifying the protections that I mentioned. Okay, so I said regulators are all about this. Some of you, well, I already spoke about dark early history of clinical research with humans, that like with thalidomide, they just didn't do it enough, or way back, for instance, in World War II, right? That's why you see the Nuremberg Code with Germany and performing horrific research in the name of scientific knowledge. Those were a wake-up call. And again, this is way back at the beginning of the century for the most part. So emergence of new ethical codes, Nuremberg Code, and then what was an important one called the Belmont Report in the late 70s that really developed the principles. And all of that led to a highly regulated endeavor with strict requirements and oversight. And just for your enjoyment, I put down the full title of the regulation, which is Code of Federal Regulations. I'm not going to read the rest. But those of us who really dig this stuff, I mean, have most of it memorized just because we're nerds. But it's very long and very specific, you'll be glad to know. And anytime any research with human subjects take place, there's an ethics review board, it's called institutional review boards, that applies this huge set of regulations to that specific, called a protocol, and makes them redo it, and then says no if it doesn't work. So there are people who apply those regulations looking at every single study that wants to be done. There. Okay, so in those regulations, broadly speaking, there are three things that those review boards look to based on the regulations. First is the trial design. Is it scientifically rigorous? They use technical experts, and there's a good reason for that. If it's sort of badly designed for getting the information you want, you would never subject humans to finding out the answer because the trial isn't designed to give good answers. So that's things like statistics and all sorts of stuff. So I'm just going to put that aside. Okay. From an ethics perspective, there really are two that are deeply important. So this one in the middle, risks are ethically acceptable. And here they mean risks of participating in the research. So there are standards that have been developed about when it's acceptable to even invite people to participate in the trial, right? You have to minimize the risks, and I put down some things that has to be reasonable in relation to the potential benefits of the participants. So again, very, very specific. Then if they say, okay, the risks are ethically, right, they're responsible ones. There's some, but it's okay relative to what it might do. Then you can invite participants to patients to participate in a trial. And I really use the word invite because it's not, we want you to do this. It's not your physician is not to say, I'd like you to do this. I think it would help you. Participating in a trial is about helping gain scientific knowledge. It might end up helping you, but the whole point is we're not sure. We have to do the research. So there are lots and lots of regulations about how to make sure that when people are invited, they don't feel pressure, that they know they get to say no, they get a decline, and there's no consequences. Okay, thanks for considering. So it has to be informed. This is what we know about it. This is what you might expect. So they have to have like understanding of what they'd be signing up for, and no pressure. Okay. So this one, I'm not going to go into the details so much as let you know that of that big set of regulations, there's a whole separate chapter on how we apply those regulations to the case of research with pregnancy women. And it makes sense because here we've got 2 lives at issue. And by the way, this isn't issues about controversial issues about abortion. I just want to make that really clear, because here when we're doing research during pregnancy, it's for women who want to continue and want a healthy baby. Okay, so everybody agrees we want a healthy baby and a healthy mom. So you have to do extra animal studies. There are specific standards for what's an acceptable risk, because gosh, we've got risks and benefits to the mom and risks and benefits to the baby. And then you have to make sure that you get consent by the pregnant woman. So so then my final slide, we've talked about how research in general works with diseases. Then we've talked about special considerations when it's a pregnant woman. And now the last thing I want to talk about is how would we design support systems for women and make sure that women really understand when we're doing preeclampsia research, okay? So how do we ensure patients understand the inherent uncertainties? Remember, it's research to gain scientific knowledge, but women who participate are hoping that this trial ends up proving to be effective and so that it will help them. So they do need to understand there's a chance it would help them, but there's a chance it won't at all. And women experiencing the deeply frightening diagnosis of preeclampsia may be so eager, desperate, reasonably desperate, to grab at something that will help, that they might sign up for this research, not understanding it's not a doctor saying this will help. It's we want you to help you. We want you to participate to help us understand if this drug works. How do we have that conversation in a way that doesn't panic them? So again, as all of you know, and Kara's group is really advocated for it. I was hearing the tail end of the last presenter. This is already, you're in a traumatic situation with huge information overload. So we don't want to panic people, and we have to engage a conversation in the midst of that emotional intensity. So one of the things Kara's group and my group have been advising that a small company on who are working to see if there's a new treatment for preeclampsia is to develop what we call wraparound services. How do you have the conversation? How do you train the nurses and physicians who are running the research to even have the conversation that can be with best practices on being in the midst of trauma? And then the fourth one is a really important one that we heard when Karen and I put on a workshop with survivors about their feelings on research. One of the things we really heard is thinking ahead to how we can try to accidentally increase the risk that the women will blame themselves if something goes wrong. So you remember, you're invited to participate in the study, right? It may help you. May not, but it may. So imagine now you say yes to this, and then something goes wrong, which it really may go wrong as a baseline because that's preeclampsia, but then something goes wrong and you can really think, I shouldn't have said yes, even though it might have had nothing to do with the drug, because baseline, lots of things are going to go wrong. There's a real risk. And conversely, if you declined and something goes wrong, you might have said, I should have said yes. That might have made the difference. So there's no ensuring that there's no blame. That's something that, as Kara's emphasized in the last session, if you didn't come in with a mental health disorder, you leave with one. I love that line, Kara. But we want to make sure that as we do the invitation to the pregnant woman, we can understand that we need to set up and indicate, you'll remember that there's a baseline chance. There's some chance this would help, but we really don't know. So don't worry about saying no. There's some chance that it can't help, and or that you'll, even if you take it, right, that it can't help, and you may have problems with preeclampsia, because that doesn't mean it would be the drug. So very, very important through all of this to put the pregnant woman and her family at the center, not just of the conversation, but of designing the whole experience from first invitation to the birth and after, right, to keep up with her and see how she and her family are doing. So I'll stop share. And Kara, I think I left a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, fantastic. I have a couple of questions. So as you were speaking, I was thinking through some things, that sort of dark history that you were talking about. I think, still obviously still informs some researchers, right, who are like, no, thank you. But I also think potentially like investors, funders for research, whether it's research or, drugs, right? They're like, that seems really risky. We're not, maybe we're not interested in supporting, research or development of a drug or a therapy in pregnant women because it's too risky, liability. We don't want to be thalidomide. And so that adds an extra layer of barrier to this, to research, right? And then I see it sort of every day when we have our members join and they say, I stopped taking my Zoloft because I'm pregnant. I just found out I'm pregnant and I don't want to put anything in my body that might hurt. And, our conversation with them is, hey, talk to your doctor, number one, but this is a risk benefit, scenario. Like the Zoloft is known to be very safe. And it's been used for a long time in pregnant people. And, what's going to happen if you're not taking your medication? What is the risk, not only to you, but whatever's going on in your body, the risk, to your fetus, because they think the risk is taking the drug, but there are other factors that can complicate, their pregnancy if they're not taking the medications that the benefits do outweigh the risks. We see it with blood pressure medications. We see it from clinicians who will say, oh, stop taking your Norvasc. That's not safe in pregnancy. It's been studied for years and years for those who have really difficult to control blood pressure medication. They can't just necessarily switch to labetalol and have that work. They may need to stay on the medication that works well for their complicated, hypertension, and there is data on that. So we see these barriers and complications, and I think this sort of dark history has informed all of these processes and how people still, whether it's funders, investors, researchers, clinicians, and our patients, on the concern is always what am I putting in my body? And I think to your point, those then leave those populations more vulnerable.
Yes. So I love two things. Well, I love you, Kara. And I love two things in what you just said. One is looking at the number of different groups that can have deep reticence, we call it, right, in our advocacy work. And at any point in that lineup, if one party has reticence, the woman's not going to get treated, right? Yeah. We're not going to get the drug, or there is a drug and the provider's going to say no, or the woman's going to be too nervous. And all of this is sort of understandable, but a lot of it is just the word I mentioned before, which is culture around this. And much of it is based on misunderstanding. So let me just focus on, well, first on the investors. I'll just say what we have heard from drug developers is it takes researchers who are passionate about researching about pregnant women and their baby and their needs. If they're not passionate, they're not. Why? There's so many other things to do. Why would they even, educate themselves. But there's an army of people who are passionate, so that's great. And then the culture shift on, for instance, with the provider and the women. And again, understandable, especially for the woman, because there's not that much research. How do you know what to do? And then even with there is, you've just got to, think of all the articles in newspapers, it ranges, this week it's, oh, don't eat X or don't do Y, and not, so we can have this, I must keep my body pure.
Yeah.
Right. And taking anything in might be dangerous. And there, exactly, you put it the right way, Kara, which is we can think about and be focused exclusively on what's the risk of taking this, but not focus on the risk of not taking it.
Yeah.
And one of the adages that people working with pregnant people have described is, as a general tenet, what's best for a healthy baby is a healthy mom. And doctors who work with pregnant women who have serious illnesses, right? That is their mantra. Are there exceptions? Yes, we have data to indicate this drug has some serious side effects on babies when taken in the second trimester. It's very specific. So we're not going to use that. We're going to do this. But you start with the default of, this is what we usually do, right? For your health, it's worked before. We're going to default to continuing it unless there's some big safety signal. And so it's that shift. Let's presume to treat you with what works and not presume to not treat you out of unfounded fear.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say, Maggie, I do this all the time with that patients will want to come in and they'll say something like, I'm on a biologic, those are beta now, or I treat a lot of patients with epilepsy. I'm on an anti-epileptic. Is this going to be totally safe? I get that phrase a lot. It's going to be totally safe. And we have to then walk through that, there's nothing that's totally safe.
Yeah, it's a bad category.
Have to do this risk benefit. And, patients get it eventually, but it's really how you communicate it. And I think, unfortunately, in our society, there's just a statistical illiteracy and an inability to really, we just don't do a good job of understanding risk.
Driving your car is very unsafe.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right. Right.
But it's exactly what I do all the time.
And I know you must on the front lines. And by the way, Tom is a brilliant genius. You guys are so lucky to have him on this. And he and I've intersected several times. So not only do we as a society tend to distort risk, right? We pay attention to one risk and not another instead of the holistic system. But our group has talked about the way there are special risk distortions when thinking during pregnancy, that the presence of the unborn baby, and again, we're talking about desired pregnancies, right, can swamp us, right? And again, culturally, to think, I need to keep my body pure. That's what gives you a healthy baby. There's no such thing as a pure body. There's a such thing as a healthy body, right? And healthy bodies often need to have interventions because there's diseases. You don't have the pure body. You've got, as Kara said, high blood pressure. Okay, how do we keep you healthy?
Thank you very much for coming to talk to us today about research and ethics in research and pregnancy and reproduction. I really appreciate your time. This is a conversation that we don't necessarily talk about it as an ethics conversation, but these are examples of these conversations we're having. And so hopefully we'll look forward to actually just directing people back to this video so they can, if they haven't seen it, they're new and joining us to understand and perhaps, have some better questions better conversations they can have with their healthcare provider,
Yes.
and receive, continue to be able to take the medications they need to take and feel more comfortable about that. and overcome sort of the dark history that still informs these topics. So thank you so much, Dr. Little.
Welcome.
We have now a break until